Welcome back to our look at the life of the great patriarch Joseph. Now, in part one, we looked at, we explored his birth, the death of his mother when he was a teenager. We saw how the favouritism his father Jacob showed to him led to his brothers hating him so much that they ended up selling him into slavery, where he ended up in Egypt at age 17. Now, he worked well and became Potiphar's chief steward. And then, after resisting the sexual advances of Potiphar's wife, she falsely accused him of rape, where he was then thrown into prison. Now, Joseph then interpreted the dreams of two of Pharaoh's servants cast into prison. Now, one of those was restored to his old position, and the other lost his life as predicted by Joseph. Now, after that, Joseph continues to languish in prison. Now, the Pharaoh, about 2 years later, then has a dream which no one else can interpret, so the butler, whose dream was correctly interpreted by Joseph, mentions to him, to the Pharaoh, and then Joseph is summoned to answer Pharaoh's dream, which is where we left Joseph at the end of part one. Now, Joseph is now before Pharaoh, and Pharaoh says to Joseph, "I've had a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it. But I've heard it said of you that you can understand a dream to interpret it." So Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, "It is not in me. God will give Pharaoh an answer of peace." Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Behold, in my dream I stood on the bank of the river. Suddenly 7 cows came up out of the river, fine looking and fat. 7 other cows came up after them, poor and very ugly. And the gaunt and ugly cows came up and ate the first 7, the fat cows. Also I saw in my dream, and suddenly 7 heads came up upon one stalk, full and good. Then behold, 7 heads withered, thin and blighted by the east wind sprang up after them, and the thin heads devoured the 7 good heads." Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, "The dreams of Pharaoh are one. God has shown Joseph Pharaoh what he's about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 thin and ugly cows which came up after them are 7 years of famine. Now therefore let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt, to collect 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt in the 7 plentiful years. Then that food shall be a reserve for the land for the 7 years of famine." So the advice was good in the eyes of Pharaoh and in all the eyes of his servants. So we see here Joseph tells the Pharaoh that the 2 different dreams that God gave him have the same interpretation. There will be 7 years of plenty, followed by 7 years of famine. Now, not only does Joseph give him the correct interpretation from God, he also gives him a solid plan to help the nation of Egypt get through the 7 years of famine by saving 1/5 of the produce during the 7 years of plenty. Now, Pharaoh is greatly impressed by the wise advice that Joseph gives him, along with the rest of Pharaoh's court. Now, this brings us to the 5th lesson that we can learn from Joseph's life. Have a contingency plan to help you deal with future problems and emergencies. Now, this is essentially the message of a proverb that is repeated twice in the book of Proverbs, in Proverbs 22 verse 3 and 27 verse 12, which says, "A prudent man foresees evil and hides himself, but the simple pass on and are punished." Now, we need to be able to look ahead to see potential problems in the future and do what we can to avoid or minimise their impact on our lives. Now, that can take many forms, like having enough savings to cover unexpected bills, taking out insurance where appropriate and needed, having enough superannuation or savings for retirement, preparing for bad weather if we are in a vulnerable area, or having supplies of items to cover ourselves in case of shortages. Like the Scouts motto, always be prepared. Now, after Joseph gave Pharaoh the interpretation and a great plan to help save the country through the famine, they would follow the years of plenty, we read. Pharaoh said to his servants, "Can we find such a one as this, a man in whom is the Spirit of God?" Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Inasmuch as God has shown you all this, there is no one as discerning and wise as you. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall be ruled according to your word. Only in regards to the throne will I be greater than you." Then Pharaoh took his signet ring off his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, and he clothed him in garments of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. Now, Egyptian records show when viziers were invested with power, they were given a signet ring, fine linen, and a gold chain. So we see here, from being a slave in prison, Joseph, in a stunning turnaround, is given the position of being second in power in Egypt, a position referred to in Egypt as a vizier. Now, the last mention of Potiphar in the book of Genesis is when he sends him to prison. We don't know how he may have felt and reacted to this sudden change of fortune in Joseph, who has now been elevated above him. Now, if he suspected his wife was lying to him about the rape charge, I suspect he would have been quite delighted to see Joseph both a free man and in a great position to serve the Egyptian people. Now, God has granted Joseph incredible favour with this Pharaoh, who has now elevated him to second in power over the Egyptian people. Now, this brings us to the sixth lesson that we can learn from Joseph's life. Maintain your trust in God through the dark times, and he will be faithful and exalt you in the long run. Now, I remember a few years back when I went through a very long period of unemployment, how tough things got for me personally. Now, I eventually changed career and became a courier. And to begin with, the pay was quite poor, and so the struggle continued for another couple of years, along with issues with my van that were very costly. It was just getting so frustrating to get ahead. Now, I then had at least 3 major unasked for offers of financial assistance from close friends that just blew me away and really made a difference in my life. And then when it came to trying to get extra pay, it went from struggling to get blood out of a stone to the windows of blessing opening up from the heavens. Now, God is good and he does care for us deeply. And when the time is right, he will exalt us if we stay faithful to him. Now, do we have any historical and archaeological evidence for Joseph and which Egyptian pharaoh it was who God gave the dreams to and who promoted Joseph to second in charge over Egypt? Now, to find evidence for Joseph, we need to confirm where in Egyptian history we need to look for such evidence. Now, I'm only going to briefly touch on these dating issues. Now, the true biblical date for the Exodus is around 1450 BC, some 480 years before Solomon's work began on the temple. However, some liberal Christian scholars argued that it occurred some 200 years later, around 1250 BC, when Ramses the Great ruled. Now, on the standard timeline of Egypt, 1450 BC falls during the time of the 18th dynasty. Now, the time period in the ancient world where dynasties 18 and 19, when Ramses the Great ruled, is referred to by archaeologists as the Late Bronze Age. Now, the main reason why there is so much skepticism in the ancient world about the Exodus and the conquest of Palestine by these Israelites is that there is a complete lack of evidence for these events during the Late Bronze Age. However, prior to the Late Bronze Age came the period known as the Middle Bronze Age, and there have been calls in recent decades for Egypt's timeline to be moved forward, with some scholars advocating that the Exodus date of around 1450 BC was at the end of Egypt's Middle Kingdom during the Middle Bronze Age. Now, in a nutshell, the two big problems that archaeologists have with believing the Bible's account of the Exodus, either during either of the two dates put forward during the 18th or 19th dynasties, are: 1. Both of the 18th and 19th dynasties are very well documented, and there is not a single hint of any great catastrophe impacting Egypt at either time. And two, most of the cities that the Bible tells us were conquered by the Israelites were not occupied during the late Bronze Age, such as Jericho. Now, one major piece of evidence putting the Exodus earlier on Egypt's timeline during the Middle Bronze Age is that we have a record from the end of the Middle Kingdom during Egypt's 13th dynasty that is eerily similar to the plagues of Egypt recorded in the book of Exodus. Now, Egypt's 18th and 19th dynasties were periods of great expansion and incredible prosperity for Egypt, the complete opposite of the state of Egypt after the plagues that God struck Egypt with. However, we know that there was a great collapse in civilization in Egypt during the 13th dynasty when Egypt was invaded by foreigners called the Hyksos, who took advantage of their weakened state. Now, this early time is a far better fit in Egypt for the Exodus than the late Bronze Age. Now, this situation is much the same in Palestine when we compare the archaeology of the Middle Bronze Age against that of the late Bronze Age. Now, in an SIS Review article called A Chart to Illustrate the Conquest of Canaan by John Bimson, he created this chart to compare the archaeological finds of both these periods. Now, for the Middle Bronze Age, there is excellent agreement for all the sites noted as being conquered by Joshua in the Bible, with most of these sites having high walls and being conquered during the Middle Bronze Age. Now, for the time of the Late Bronze Age, Jericho has no Late Bronze city, and most of the cities noted as being conquered by Joshua have little or no remains at all in the Late Bronze Age. Now, if the Exodus did indeed take place at the end of the Middle Kingdom, then the correct place on Egypt's timeline to find Joseph, as well as his Pharaoh, is in the early to middle part of Egypt's Middle Kingdom. Now, the time in Egypt is when the 12th dynasty ruled. Now, Donovan Corville and David Roll are two scholars who support a Middle Bronze Age Exodus. Now, they advocate two different 12th dynasty pharaohs for the pharaoh that elevated Joseph to power. Now, David Roll chooses Amenemhat III, the sixth pharaoh of the 12th dynasty, as Joseph's pharaoh. Now, he is the rather miserable looking chap on the right hand side there. Now, Donovan Corville, however, chooses the much happier looking guy on the left, Sesostris I, as Joseph's pharaoh. Now, Sesostris I was an earlier pharaoh. He was the second pharaoh of that dynasty. Now, Donovan Corville sees a number of lines of evidence supporting a significant overlap between the two dynasties of the 12th and 13th dynasty, hence why he chooses an earlier pharaoh. Now, David Roll notes in Pharaoh's dream that the fat cows and the skinny cows both come out of the Nile, indicating that the Nile is the source of both the famine and the plenty. Now, this seems somewhat logical. Now, David Roll provides evidence of high Nile floods of Amenemhat III's reign and points to this as being from the time of Joseph's rise to power. Now, he actually claims that excessive rainfall caused upstream caused excess flooding and was the source of the famine. Now, personally, I don't find this very compelling at all, as naturally you would think too little rain rather than too much rain would cause the famine. Excuse me. Now, this seems to be supported in the biblical account, since the famine was also felt very hard in neighbouring countries where flooding would not have caused the famine. Now, as you can see from the statue of Amenemhat III, he's a rather miserable looking pharaoh. Now, David Roll believes that the downturned face of Amenemhat III, as well as Sesostris III, who looks much the same, is the result of a sad anxiety from the stress of the times brought on by famine. Now, regardless of whether that is true or not, I think I'll just start calling him Pharaoh Grumpy Cat. Now, Donovan Corville believes that the 12th and 13th dynasties were mostly parallel, except for at the end of the 12th dynasty when two dynasty 13 rulers ruled over Egypt after the end of the 12th dynasty, prior to the Exodus. Now, in his book, The Exodus Problem and Its Ramifications, he writes that in the royal tomb of Ra-Ab, who was the 13th king in the middle of the 13th dynasty, were found canopic jars still sealed with the clay impression reading Ra in Mut, which is a name that's recognised as the alternate name of Amenhotep III, who ruled late in the 12th dynasty. Now, if this be true, then this would mean that there's quite a bit of overlap between these two dynasties. Now, Josephus actually wrote that the Israelites were involved in building pyramids when they were in Egypt. Now, the lesser pyramids of the Middle Kingdom were the only pyramids built with mud, straw and bricks, the same materials noted in the Bible that were used by the Israelites for building during the slavery. Now, one of these mud brick pyramids is right next to the town of Kahun, which definitely has a Semitic settlement. Now, Kahun is several miles away from the mud brick pyramid of Amenhotep III, who David Roll believes was Joseph's pharaoh, but it also happens to be right next to the pyramid of Sesostris II. Now, Sesostris II reigned 2 pharaohs before David Roll's candidate for Joseph's pharaoh, Amenhotep III. Now, the Semitic dwellers of Kahun were likely the Israelites who would have been the likely workforce for the pyramid of Sesostris II, yet that pharaoh reigned as pharaoh 2 kings before David Roll's candidate. Now, Sesostris I, just going on his appearance, looks like a more happy chap, the sort of nice guy you would expect to have shown Joseph favour and appreciation. Now, based on the evidence that Donovan Corwell has presented, I believe that he is the most likely pharaoh to have been Joseph's pharaoh. Now, in Genesis 41:50, we read that Joseph married Asenath, the daughter of Potipharah, who was the priest of On. Now, at On, there is an obelisk there today known as the Pillar of On, which was built by Sesostris I. Now, the word On means city of the sun, which is why, the Greeks later called it Heliopolis, and Jeremiah, in Jeremiah 13, And Jeremiah in Jeremiah 43:13 refers to On as Beth Shemesh, the same name as the city in Israel where the ark was eventually brought back by the Philistines, which means house of the sun. Now, On, which is close to Pharaoh, was the capital of Egypt during the Middle Kingdom, so this is another piece of good evidence supporting the Middle Kingdom as the time of Joseph, rather than the Hyksos period where the standard chronology dates the time of Joseph. Now, Joseph was given a new name by the Pharaoh, the name of Zaphnath-Paneah, and this title means the salvation or abundance of the life or living. Now, the Pharaoh is deeply grateful for his role as a saviour of the people, even at the start of the 7 years of plenty followed by famine. Now, this high title means salvation or saviour of the living. Now, Sesostris I had a powerful vizier by the name of Mentuhotep, and he held titles that, according to Breasted, read like the declaration of the king's powers, which is similar to the extraordinary titles that Joseph's pharaoh bestowed upon him. Now, 2 of them shown here are particularly interesting: overseer of the double granary and giver of good, sustaining alive the people. Now, sustaining alive the people sounds very much like the meaning of Zaphnath-Paneah that we just looked at. Now, Mentuhotep's statue on the right-hand side there in the Louvre in Paris has been decapitated, much like the destruction of the statue in the vizier's residence at Avaris that we're going to look at shortly. Now, this destruction is easily understandable in light of the hatred of the Israelites fostered by the pharaohs that lived after Joseph, who enslaved the Israelites. Now, during the 7 years of plenty, Joseph's wife Asenath bears Joseph 2 sons. Now the firstborn he calls Manasseh, which means forget, because God has helped him forget all the bad times he's experienced in Egypt and also how his brothers treated him. Now the second son he calls Ephraim, which means doubly fruitful, because God has extra blessed him in Egypt, where he originally came to as a slave. Now in Lessons from Jacob, we looked at some of the evidence that points to the descendants of Joseph becoming the British and American peoples. Now up until recently, these peoples were overwhelmingly Caucasian in appearance. Now Joseph has married an Egyptian woman by nationality, but what was her ethnicity or racial appearance? Now today most Egyptians have reddish brown skin, being mostly Arabs. Now ancient Egyptian artists portrayed the skin of Egyptian males by painting them red. And Egyptian women of high rank, by contrast, were not reddened by long exposure to the sun, spending most of their time indoors. Now upper class women were usually represented by their artists with pale or light yellow skin. Now the statues of the pharaohs over the many dynasties do show variances in racial types. Now while it's hard to be definitive with statues that are only one major colour in appearance, the statue of Joseph's pharaoh Sesostris I does look more Caucasian than Arab in appearance, so the nobility of his time may have reflected that racial appearance. Now Colville has additional evidence supporting his view that the second pharaoh of the 12th dynasty, Sesostris I, was Joseph's pharaoh. Now Colville notes two famine inscriptions which are dated to the time of Sesostris I. Now the famine inscriptions of Ameni and Biba both meet the criteria for the famine of Joseph's time in three major aspects. The famine lasted a plurality of years. Preparation was made in advance to meet the famine by gathering the gathering of food. And thirdly, this food was distributed during the years of famine. Now Grant Jeffrey, in his book The Signature of God, gives the remarkable translation of two ancient inscriptions that were found in Yemen at the bottom of the Arabian Peninsula. Now the first inscription reads, "We dwelt in this castle 7 years of good life. How difficult for memory its description. Then came years barren and burnt up. When one evil year had passed away, then came another to succeed it." And the second inscription reads, "In thy name, O God, the God of Hammua, I, Tarja, the daughter of Zeus Zephyr, sent to my steward, to Joseph." And before she talks about the difficulties getting the grain. Now Joseph had to be careful selling the grain reserves of Egypt for gold and silver to everyone because of the danger that the grain would run out. And when the famine was at its peak, grain was much more valuable than gold or silver. Now this brings us back to the story of Joseph and his family, who now have to find a way to get through the 7 years of famine. Now we pick up the story again in Genesis 42, which I'll paraphrase. Now Jacob sends all his sons except for Benjamin down to Egypt to buy grain. Now Joseph saw his brothers and recognized them, but he acted as a stranger to them and spoke roughly to them, accusing them of being spies. Now to prove that they're not spies, Joseph demands they bring Benjamin to Egypt while he holds on to Simeon. Now the brothers are laden with guilt, believing that this horrible situation has come upon them because of what they did earlier to Joseph. Now Joseph pretends not to know the language of Canaan by speaking through an interpreter, but turns away and weeps when he hears how guilty they feel about selling him as a slave. He then gives them grain, but arranges to put their grain money in their sacks without them realising it. And when they return to Canaan, they are horrified to find the money in their sacks. Now in chapter 43 we read how they use up all their grain and still need more. Now Jacob relents, Jacob then relents on allowing them to take Benjamin to Egypt. Now Jacob tells them to take the original money they found in their sacks back to Joseph, plus more to buy more grain, plus an additional gift. Now when they reach Egypt, Joseph has them dine with them at lunchtime. Now, after inquiring about their father and being introduced to Benjamin, he is overwhelmed with emotion at seeing Benjamin and ducks out again to weep. Now, Joseph then arranges to have them sit in age of order, astonishing the brothers, and gives 5 times as much food to young Benjamin. Now, in chapter 44, we read that Joseph sells them more grain and then tests the brothers one more time by arranging to have a cup placed in Benjamin's sack. Now, Joseph's steward accuses them of stealing the cup and then discovers the cup in Benjamin's sack. Now, Joseph then accuses them of stealing and pretends that he can practice divination in such a cup. He decrees that Benjamin shall become his slave. Now, Judah then pleads to take his place as his slave, which is a remarkable turnaround for Judah, who was the one who suggested that they sell Joseph to the passing traders way back when Joseph was 17. Now, in chapter 5, we read that eventually Joseph cannot hold it back any longer. He is weeping unconditionally, so he sends out his servants and tells the brothers, "I am Joseph." Now, this would have been such an incredibly emotional scene that is well portrayed in the Time Life movie about Joseph, starring Aussie actor Paul Mercurio, better known from the movie Strictly Ballroom. Now, Joseph shows mercy and forgiveness to his brothers, telling them that it was God's will that he go to Egypt and be put into a position to preserve life. Now, this brings us to lesson 7 that we can learn from Joseph's life. Have a forgiving attitude like Joseph had with his brothers who sold him into slavery. Now, Joseph saw God's hand in everything that had happened, from his first dreams to his enslavement, imprisonment, exaltation, and at last, reconciliation with his family. Now, later in chapter 50, he tells his brothers, "You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring it about as it is this day, to save many people alive." Now, permeating Joseph's pronouncement of God's guidance of events is the expression of forgiveness for all that they had done to him. Now, forgiveness requires a willingness to trust God that he will work things out for us and eventually bring about justice. We should see everyone as a potential son of God or daughter of God. Now, eventually, everyone will repent of their sins, or God will cast them into the lake of fire. We should trust that God will restore what another may have taken from us, and that he will provide for us always. We don't need to, and we shouldn't harbour a grudge or hold on to anger against others, knowing that God will always provide for us. Now, he has forgiven each of us of so much. Now, if we sense we're holding on to a grudge, we should remember Jesus' stern words that God will not forgive us if we do not forgive others. Now, at this point, there are still 5 years of famine to go, and Joseph tells them to let Jacob know that he is still alive and he has been made vizier over Egypt, and to ask Jacob to bring his family down to Egypt. Now, Joseph now sends a message via his brothers to his father to tell him that he is alive and well. As we said, we're into the 2nd year of the famine, and this is now 9 years since he was elevated by the Pharaoh to second in charge over Egypt. Now, while he was a slave, he wouldn't have been able to get a message to his father. Yet when he is free during the 7 years of plenty and has the means to get a message to his father, why didn't he do so then? Now, in a 1993 Bible Review article called "Why Joseph Didn't Call Home," Arnold Aegis gives what I believe is the most logical answer for why he didn't send a message earlier. He wrote, "Perhaps Joseph's silence over the years can be explained on the basis of political expediency, as suggested by the medieval exegete Aben Badel. As Pharaoh's second in command, Joseph had to be extremely circumspect in terms of his attachments and relationships. He was, after all, a foreigner, a non-Egyptian. There could be no suspicion regarding his absolute loyalty to the Egyptian crown." End of quote. Now, we don't know for sure where Jacob is when he gets the news about Joseph, though it is more likely he is in Hebron than Shechem. Now, it says his heart stood still because he did not believe them when he was given the unbelievable news that Joseph is both alive and vizier over Egypt. He then sees the many carts of goods set up with the brothers, which convinces him that the news must be true. Now, when he gets to Beersheba on his way down to Egypt, he makes a sacrifice, and God encourages him in a dream to continue on to Egypt. Now, in Genesis 46:26, we're told that the 11 sons of Jacob, and their children numbered 66. Now, in the next verse, we're told that all the persons of the house of Jacob who went to Egypt were 70. Now, the additional 4 people apart from the 66 just mentioned were Jacob, Joseph, and his 2 sons. Now, in the Septuagint, 75 is the number mentioned here in verse 27, not 70, not 66, not 70. And this number of 75 is also quoted by Stephen in his famous sermon in Acts 7. Now, some commentators believe this number of 75 is the 66 mentioned previously, plus the 9 living wives of the sons of Jacob. Now, remember the story of Abraham, where it said that there were over 300 men born in the household when he decides to rescue Lot. Now, there was a large entourage of servants, perhaps even more than 1,000, yet we get the impression, that the women, who were mostly of the same race as them, were off limits, at least for Isaac and Jacob, as their fathers sought wives for them back in Haran. So how did Joseph's brothers get their wives? They're just about all married when they go to Egypt. Now, it's likely that Jacob relaxed any restrictions that they may have been in place previously by allowing them to marry the servants of the household. Now, the last time we read about Jacob's only daughter, Dinah, is the debacle that occurred in Shechem after Simeon and Levi killed her husband. Now, we don't know if she ever remarried. Now, if she did and had children, is there some sort of lost 13th tribe of Dinah out there? Now, any children she may have had would have been counted as members of the tribe of their father rather than their mother. Now, she may have married one of the brothers, as Jewish legends suggest, or she may have married one of the servants of Jacob's household. And what about all of those servants? Did they come down to Egypt as well? Now, it's likely that the descendants of any that came down would have been subsumed into the general population of Egypt at the same time that the Israelites were later enslaved. Now, perhaps some of their descendants formed part of the mixed multitude that came out of Egypt at the time of the Exodus. And now comes the big reunion of Jacob and Joseph. Now, verses 29 and 30 of Genesis 46 we read, "So Joseph made ready his chariot and went up to Goshen to meet his father Israel, and he presented himself to him and fell on his neck and wept on his neck a good while. And Israel said to Joseph, 'Now let me die, since I have seen your face, because you are still alive.'" Now, this would have been an incredible reunion between Jacob and Joseph after Jacob thought for over 20 years that Joseph was dead. Now, what an amazing happy ending to the story of Jacob's life, to be reunited with Joseph for the last 17 years of his life that he'll spend in Egypt. Now, the land of Goshen is a very fertile part of Egypt and the eastern part of the Nile Delta, which is where Jacob and his family and Joseph will also settle. Now, when I spoke about Abraham, we looked at the question of what the occupation of the patriarchs was, and it's usually assumed that they were just shepherds or herders of livestock. Now, if they were just shepherds, the following passage here in Genesis 46 would seem out of place. Now, it would seem that they were much more than just herders of livestock. Now, Joseph tells them to just focus on this one part of your overall business so that the Pharaoh will give you the land of Goshen. Now, the standard chronology of Egypt places the time of Joseph during the reign of the foreign Hyksos kings that conquered Egypt after the fall of Egypt's Middle Kingdom. Now, this verse here provides some evidence against that view. Now, in his work against Appian, the first century Jewish historian Josephus refers to the Hyksos as shepherd kings. Now, if Joseph's Pharaoh was a Hyksos shepherd king, then it would make no sense that shepherds were an abomination to them. Now, Exodus 1 verse 11 says that the Israelites built Ramses, which is believed to be Pi-Ramesses, built during the 19th dynasty in the reign of Ramses the Great. Now, underneath that 19th dynasty city of Pi-Ramesses, Manfred Bitak uncovered an older city. Now, Bitak identified this older city as the ancient city of Avaris. Now, today the site is referred to as Tel El Dama. Now, based on drill samples right across the area, they determined the course of the branch of the Nile that went through the area during the Middle Kingdom. Now, notice at the top of the map the location of the 12th dynasty palace. Now, on the right, you can see the beautiful bronze daggers found in the Semitic settlement whose style has been traced back to the land of Canaan. Now, notice too on the map the location of what is believed to have been the palace of the Pharaoh's vizier. Now, there was evidence of sheep and goats indicating that many people here were shepherds. Now, one remarkable structure that was excavated at Avaris in the eastern Nile Delta was a palace that was built over an original 4-roomed house. Now, in one place in the palace it has 12 colonnades, and there were found 12 tombs within its gardens. Now, one of those tombs was particularly unusual. It was pyramid-shaped. Now, in this Semitic dignitary's tomb, there was no trace of bones that were found of this particular individual. Now, grave robbers don't steal bones, so it seems that the body was removed rather than stolen. Now, some scholars, such as David Roll, believe that this was the tomb of Joseph. Now, in it was a large broken statue that, when it was still intact, would have stood twice the height of a normal man. Now, this particular statue was of a Semitic man with red hair, and the traces of paint showed that he had a coat that was red, blue, and gold. Now, those three colours also dominated the interior of the palace. Now, the face of the statue was defaced, but based on what was found, the middle picture shows what it would have originally looked like. Now, this is a short video produced by the University of Vienna, who was the team that excavated this particular site of Avaris. Now, they don't draw any conclusions about this being an Israelite settlement at all. So notice here on the left there you can see the tombs. And we see here the 12 colonnades in the courtyard. And notice how these same three colours found on the coat of the vizier's statue dominate the interior: red, blue and gold, which coincidentally are the same colours of today's British royal family. Now, during the Middle Kingdom, when Israel was in Egypt, inscriptions with a script called the Proto-Sinaitic script have been found in Egypt, the Sinai and Canaan. Now, examples of the script in these places includes dates that note years within the reign of Amenhotep III, one of the late 12th dynasty pharaohs, though the script could have been around earlier than his reign. Now, it bears a certain similarity to both Egyptian hieroglyphs and Hebrew, but there are far too few symbols to have been a picture language like hieroglyphics. Now, Egyptian hieroglyphics and Mesopotamian cuneiform were made up of hundreds of different symbols like, say, Japanese today, making it a cumbersome language to learn and requiring far more space to convey the same content compared to an alphabetic language. Now, like Hebrew and Phoenician, the Proto-Sinaitic script has only just over 20 symbols, making it the world's first true alphabet that we know about. Now, the documentary The Moses Controversy makes a strong case that this was an earlier version of Hebrew and it may have originated at the time of Joseph, being the first alphabetic script that we know about. Now, Jacob is now very close to dying and he is about to pass on the birthright, the double portion of his inheritance, that not only included his physical estate, but promises of great national wealth to their descendants. Now, he's about to pass it on to Joseph's sons, but before he does something rather unusual. He formally adopts Joseph's sons as his own. Now, by adopting Joseph's boys as his own sons, they were to actually be considered full sons of Israel and full brothers of the others. Now, we see this take effect with the tribal allotments in the land of Israel. Now, you'll notice if you've seen any maps of the allotments of the tribes, that there is no allotment to Joseph. There is instead allotments that go to Ephraim and Manasseh. Now, they effectively become the 12th and 13th tribes of Israel. Now, the number 13 is very much connected to the tribe of Manasseh, who we in the Church of God believe became the great nation of the United States. Now, Gordon Tucker, in a Biblical Review article from June 1994 entitled Jacob's Terrible Burden, offers one intriguing possibility for why Jacob adopted Joseph's sons. Now, if you recall when Jacob fled from Laban, Rachel stole Laban's household gods and didn't realise that Rachel had stolen them. Now, in Genesis 31:32, Jacob made a rash vow and he said, "With whomever you find your gods, do not let him live." Now, this rash vow would have haunted him later when Rachel surrendered the idols to him at Shechem. Now, soon after that, Rachel died in childbirth. Now, with that vow in mind, he may have been haunted by guilt, thinking that his vow cost Rachel her life. Now, the guilt might have also explained the neurotic favouritism and protection of Joseph and Benjamin that he showed to them. Now, Tucker comments that the adoption of Ephraim and Manasseh, even if it did not literally give Rachel more children, at least gave Jacob 2 more children from her, posthumously giving Rachel the additional children she never had, end of quote. Now, Albert Barnes in his commentary states the right of primogeniture had been forfeited by Reuben. The double portion in the inheritance is now transferred to Joseph. He is the firstborn of her, who was intended by Jacob to be his first and only wife. He has also been the means of saving all his father's house, end of quote. Now, the specific birthright promise God gave to Jacob in Genesis 35:11 of his descendants becoming a nation and a company of nations, he now passes directly onto Joseph's 2 sons. His eyesight is very dim, and Joseph directs his oldest son Manasseh next to Jacob's right hand to be given the greater blessing, but Jacob, under God's inspiration, crosses his arms over to give the younger son Ephraim the greater blessing. Now, Jacob, in blessing the sons of Joseph in Genesis 48:19, says that one son, Manasseh, would become a great nation, and his other son, Ephraim, would become a multitude, or as we might say, a commonwealth of nations. Now, before the Assyrian captivity, the tribe of Joseph's son Ephraim was never a multitude of nations. It was originally a tribe within the United Nation of Israel, and then the northern kingdom of Israel after Solomon. So this could only be a prophecy for after the northern kingdom went into captivity at the hands of the Assyrians. Now, as I discussed in the last part of Lessons to Jacob, the descendants of the northern kingdom in the centuries after the fall of the Assyrian Empire eventually migrated northwest into Europe. Now, there are no other brother nations today that come close to fulfilling that ancient prophecy, as well as the English-speaking nations of Britain, who became a multitude or commonwealth of nations, and America, who later became that single great nation. Now, the patriarch Jacob, before he died, gave a series of prophecies in Genesis 49 about the descendants of each of his 12 sons and what would befall them in the last days, which most likely does refer to the time leading up to the second coming of Jesus Christ. Now, on the handout on the tribes of Israel that I gave to you last time, when we went through the lessons from Jacob, I've given notes on the identity of each of the tribes in our modern day based on the clues and indirect historical evidence. Now, while Joseph inherited the birthright, Judah received the blessing of the patriarchal rule, or the scepter promise, as noted in verse 10. Now, Joseph had his own patriarchal household, and Judah would have been the next patriarch over the other brothers after Jacob died. Now, from his tribe would come the kings that ruled over Israel. Now, Shiloh means tranquility, but in reference to a person, it is interpreted as the peaceable one or peacemaker. Now, most people recognise this prophecy of the Messiah through Shiloh, though Shiloh is also a variant of Solomon, which means peace. Now, Jacob died 17 years after moving the family to Egypt when Joseph was 56 years old. Joseph and his brothers took him up to Hebron to be buried in a cave that Abraham bought as a burial place. Now, during the 12th dynasty in the Middle Kingdom, a long 200-mile canal was built parallel with the Nile River that greatly increased the amount of land able to be cultivated, as well as siphoning off excessive floodwaters. Now, while not called this in ancient times, the Arabs today refer to it as Bar Yusuf, which in English means the Canal of Joseph. Now, the story of its creation is told in the Jewish Week and the American Examiner of July 22, 1983, where it is said that when Joseph was more than 100, he still held a high position in the Egyptian court. The other viziers and court officials, envying Joseph, persuaded the Pharaoh that to remain venerated, Joseph should not rest on his laurels. He must prove again his abilities. Now, when the Pharaoh agreed, the viziers suggested an impossible project: to convert the desert into a fertile area. Now, inspired by God, Joseph confounded his detractors by succeeding. He dug further canals and created the vast official lake in 1,000 days. End of quote. Now, Joseph lives on for another 54 years after his father Jacob died. Now, before he died, he told his family to take his bones up to the promised land when God would lead them out of Egypt. Now, he died at the ripe old age of 110 years old and was embalmed and laid to rest in the tomb at his palace. Now, later, during the Exodus, his bones were exhumed and taken up to the promised land. Now, unlike Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, he wasn't buried in the family cave tomb at Hebron, but he was buried in the plot of land Joseph's family inherited from Jacob at Shechem. Now, so that brings us to the conclusion of the remarkable life of the last of the four great patriarchs of Israel. Now, here are the 7 great lessons that we can learn from the life of Joseph. 1, be aware of when others have an issue with you and do your part to reconcile with them. 2, have a strong, positive work ethic, even in the worst of working situations like Joseph. 3, flee sexual immorality like Joseph did when tempted by Potiphar's wife. 4, give the credit to God for the opportunities, knowledge and help that he gives you to succeed in life like Joseph did. 5, have a contingency plan to help you deal with future problems and emergencies. 6, maintain your trust in God through the dark times and he will be faithful and exalt you in the long run. 7, have a forgiving attitude like Joseph had with his brothers who sold him into slavery. So let's put all those lessons into practice and be faithful stewards of God, just like Joseph.